So welcome everybody to our last seminar in this first series of science diplomacy seminars. So every Thursday for the last 2 months, we have discussed this subject of science diplomacy with a very diverse panel of speakers. So it's been very interesting, and I think we reached our goal, which was to build a foundation here in our institute and our university, to have this aspect, to talk about science diplomacy and to build opportunities for science diplomacy. And so it was very, I think, very successful in this way, um, uh, this first series. And the other thing that I wanted to say, we need to thank very, very much Maria Augusta, who was actually the person who organized this and helped us in every step of the way. So actually, the idea of doing this series of seminar started after a seminar that she gave here, and it was super successful. And we asked her for her help to start this initiative here. So she was the mastermind behind it, and it was thanks to her that it happened. So I will pass the word so she can introduce our last and very special speaker, Professor Jorge Guimarães. Thank you, Guta. Thank you, Professor Jorge Guimarães.
Leticia, it's an honor and a pleasure to work with you and with Juliana and colleagues at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, where I think that it's the start of my scientific history that led me to be supervised by Cristina, that is here as well, led me to then meet Juliana at UFRJ. And I'm here talking because I'm the scientific granddaughter of this amazing thinker, academic, um, chief executive, that is our very dear Professor Jorge Guimarães. So Professor Jorge Guimarães is presently the president of EMBRAP, the Brazilian Agency for Industrial Research and Innovation. He holds a PhD from the Federal University of São Paulo and a postdoctoral fellowship in biochemistry from the National Institute of Health in the United States. He has held a number of teaching research positions in several Brazilian universities, including a full professorship at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, where we are today, the Federal Fluminense University, and the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. In different periods, he worked as a visiting research fellow at the Henry Ford Hospital, Cornell University Medical College, and at the University of Arizona. He has published over 170 scientific articles in international journals and 3 dozen of other texts about science and policy in Brazil. He was Chief Executive Officer, CEO in the science technology of a number of science technology agencies in Brazil, CNPq, the Brazil-Argentina Center of Biotechnology, and CAPES. He is recipient of several prizes and awards. As an example, the Brazilian National Great Cross of the Order of the Scientific Merit. Professor Guimarães is also a member of the Brazilian Academy of Sciences. Thank you very much for the honor of having you here, Professor, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maria Augusta, Juliana. It's a great pleasure to participate in this initiative, so important initiative, join together UFRJ and University of Nottingham. In fact, this is a very exciting subject, which is more or less inside of each one of us. Maria Augusta has a phrase that says that every scientist is a diplomat. as a diplomat. So it's more or less like that. But we do not have this as, we're not very conscious about this, but it exists. And at the beginning here, I would make some a difference between science diplomacy and the scientific diplomacy. Science diplomacy is the most well known and practiced by many persons. As I said, some of them, they know they're doing that, and some others, they do not know that, and they are doing this very, very efficiently. Why scientific diplomacy is the methodology of helping people to practice this science diplomacy with some kind of interest, some kind of objective. It's more or less what I have been doing. That's why I put scientific diplomacy instead of science diplomacy, but it's end up being the same thing. But the methodology is very important, as you know, several mechanisms that we must practice in order to have this possibility of bringing science diplomacy more close to more well used throughout the world. As most of you know, I have been running around during my career, though being almost everything being very surprised. So I say that I'm a person that a good-looking person, because if you knew where I come from, you would say that this guy has no possibility to go any place. But anyway, because of poverty, that's where I have to confront for several years of my life. So I have the pleasure to have Cássia now helping me to present the slides. Please, Cássia, go to the next one. So this story that I'm not saying that I have very few possibilities to go to any place, this has been just now described by many persons that wrote part of this book, which was organized and edited by Professor Célio da Cunha in Brasilia, and where we have several friends being write some chapter of this book. And my own chapter, somehow I presented my life as it happened, and it was based in a very nice gift I received from Christina and Elena, who designed and produced a story of this of the first part of this story up to the year when I was 70 years old. This is a video which is several hours of being organized during several hours of deployments and some kind of declarations and so on, but it was reduced for about 50 minutes where this book was based on. So, saying this shows that what I have been changing very much my career, considering, for instance, something very unusual in Brazil that very few of our colleagues, professors and scientists, they move around in Brazil. It's very hard to see this kind of movement. In my case, it was completely different. So I have been running for several universities under other schools in Brazil. And I was dedicated to biochemistry, which was my background with my scientific advisor and my mentor in science, Professor Fernando Braga Ubatuba, at the Universidade Rural in Rio de Janeiro. Next, Cássia, please. And concerning the other side of my movements, this included my experience of some agents, CNPq, that everyone knows, that I stayed there for 4 years as a director. I introduced something that we are very proud about, that is the PBIC, very well known from every scientist in Brazil. We created that there in 1991, and we have been growing this very much. Next was this next class. CAPES, where I stayed for 11 years and 3 months, and which also is a very great time of my life as a scientific coordinator of growing science in Brazil. And we are very proud of that also, because several things that are going out, were going out. Now it's everything is under suspicion and it's under being destroyed. But anyway, we have still something going on at CAPES. And next is something now, it's where I am now. Next, Cássia. embriac. This is a very interesting institution, which is a private institution that put together whatever have been made in science and technology, in practice now, bring it to do that, for generating many jobs inside the other side of universities, which are the industrial companies in Brazil. So this has been, I'm now for a little bit more than 6 years, and this is something that we are very, very proud of it, and they are doing very interesting results, putting together the experience and the competence of the several university groups in applied science and mostly in technological sciences, together with companies. And this is something very, very, very necessary in Brazil. Since Brazil did not create the culture of interaction between private companies and universities, which everybody, every country, every developed country practices deeply in obtaining several good examples of this kind of interaction. In the case of Brazil, this is even more necessary because we do not create this culture. So every student, they may be surprised why the companies that do not have research centers, 99% of our industry do not have their own research centers. And of course, being so, they do not contract the best of our students, for instance, to doing technological development. And because of this, it becomes more necessary. And in the case of our fields, which are related to biomedical science and the pharmaceutical company, this is even worse, especially in Brazil. So we are doing hard work to put together these two parts, that is not only necessary, but it's feasible, it's possible to go on this subject. Next, guys. Okay, so science, scientific as individual diplomatic passport. Next. Of course, this exercise of this this the science as a mechanism for diplomacy has been doing since the sapiens were created, organized, and especially during the first revolutions, the scientific revolution, for instance, the industrial revolution, and the other steps of the evolution of our species. The first one being cognitive revolution, which was very important. Since then, there was two sides of this problem for our inhabitants to confront. Wars, which still today keep going on as a counterpoint against science. And science and wars. Many part of these components, especially on the side of the wars, there was a very bad influence of religion. So what these guys, such as Charles Darwin, for instance, and many others before him, decided science is more important than wars. Let's go this side. Next, please. So was Humboldt that they both there here in Brazil. They confront a lot of difficulties to do their job here, but this is another point that increases very much. Humboldt had a lot of experience, especially in the Amazon region, and brought here many of his experience and his competence to do this science instead of wars. Next. Abdul Salam is a good example. This is an Indian scientist that got his Nobel Prize in Physics, and he creates the Academy of Science, of the Third War Academy of Science. Today has a different name, but it represents the same thing. It was a very important person, and you could put a lot of foreign people that have been doing this kind of effort throughout the world, especially concerning Brazil. Next. But we also have several examples. Next, please. Here I pointed some important names. I say José Bonifácio was a chemist by background, and was a very important person during our period of the Republic Brazilian. Rui Barbosa, Almirante Álvaro Alberto, that has his name related to the creation of the CNPq. Casimiro Montenegro, filho, who creates the ITA, which was a very important step to allow the development of Embraer, for instance, which was doing later on by Osiris Silva. Carlos Chagas, many of you know personally Chagas, or at least by his important name. Chagas was even a kind of ambassador at the Vatican, doing this kind of approximation of science and religion. Anísio Teixeira, who creates the CAPES and the INEP, and Osiris Silva, as I said, as a creator of and more recently, José Israel Vargas, still alive, is an important person, also in doing. I put a lot of other names here. Next, please. For instance, as a homage to our Institute of Microbiology, Professor Paulo de Góes, of course, a name that put the microbiology in a high level of our scientific development in Brazil. Next. This is an example of some of these efforts that's kind of Embraer. Today, one of the main clients of Embrapi, with several projects being developed between Embraer and the EMBRA-P units. In fact, 16 projects have been developed together with Embraer and ISA Enterprise and the EMBRA-P units. Next. Here, one of the most significant example in the agriculture, Professor Alisson Paulinelli, who creates Embrapa, this very fundamental Brazilian research corporation that is working throughout the country. Professor Alisson Paulinelli was a candidate for the Nobel Prize this year. Unfortunately, he was not selected, but his work has been a lot important to release, at least diminish the hunger throughout the world. Imagine that in 1970s, a little bit earlier, Brazil imported food and received milk from the United States as a donation. Imagine what this guy represents for our science policy. Next. Okay, next. Here, several examples of organizations throughout the world that is intrinsically involved in this science and also scientific diplomacy, because they just finance the exercise of this as an important component with the international collaboration. Now you have Ford Foundation, Fulbright, America Association for Advance of Science, the equivalent of our SBPC, Santander Bank, TWIS, was created by our, as I mentioned before, Fundación Carolina in Spain, CAPES, COFECUB, it's I guess today is more than 40 years of experience. DAD from German, also very important. The Chinese National Science Foundation, CERN, NIH, Instituto Cervantes, NASA, and many others that you could include here as important instruments for science and diplomacy. Next, please. In the case of Brazil, we can select here SBBC, Fundação Lehman is a very important work on this subject, Academy of Science. And I put here one very interesting example, it's Central Brazil-Argentina Biotechnology Center, which I directed for several years, first as a Brazilian director and then as international director, which is still working, and we have today several thousands of young Brazilians and Argentinians that were trained through this instrument. And of course, one very important component of this effort is the science without border. Everyone knows very much. Next. Okay, here's presenting some of these examples already mentioned, and I didn't include before FAPESP. FAPESP has a very important instrument for international collaboration and has been doing very well. We are just starting writing one document about the 60 years of FAPESP operation, concerning especially the group that were involved together with Professor Hernan Chamovitch and the other persons about the work of FAPESP in international collaboration, international cooperation. Next, please. This is extremely important instrument, the Cirrus, at our CNPq, our instrument for synchrotron lights, the analysis of molecules and materials to this instrument that is today one of the more modern one in the whole world. Next. Fiocruz, of course, of good memory of Augusta. She worked there for several years. And of course, it has a long tradition of this cooperation, international cooperation, especially in their expertise in tropical medicine, for instance. Next. Butantan Institute, another 100-year-old institution that also developed the antiserums for several venems, and this is together through this instrument. Butantan is recognized in every part of the world, and also is helping to develop more with other countries on this important component of this called today one of neglected disease, which comes from the envenomation of many persons, especially in the more poor countries, especially in agricultural areas. Next. Our Itamaraty, it's an example of not only of building, but also to the important is they have to help Brazil to create good ambience throughout the world for science diplomacy. As you can see a little bit ahead, you can see that you have been appointing some of the important diplomats coming from Itamaraty to the world, helping Brazil to develop its science. Next. Is cooperation alone enough? This is a very important step. This was on our time at CAPES, how many countries we have been involved in general, in cooperation throughout the world. This is actually, this slide is before, I believe, the Science Without Borders. With Science Without Borders, this was increased very much. That's a capacity of open possibilities for our students, our scientists throughout the world. Next. Also, at CAPES and together with Itamaraty, we had something very, very important. Many of our most recognized scientists, they pass through this system. It's called a share in the main universities throughout the world. We made the agreement before, and the CAPES support these shares with many of our scientists that had a chance to participate in several important universities throughout the world. Next. I don't know if it's still going on. Another point very important that I just show here, it's one of ours. I still have work with students, and as you know, not only in experimental science, but also in this something that I like very much, that's scientometrics, which is very close to the concept of science diplomacy. This is the correlation between international cooperation and impact, scientific impact. The word says, the graphic says its own. How much citation, more collaboration, international collaboration. Next. In fact, it's important to say that Brazil is one of the countries that has the lowest, one of the lowest level of international cooperation. This slide shows this. Here we have Colombia, Chile, Mexico, Argentina, Brazil. Brazil is the last line, the green line below. Ou seja, at this time, it was 2017 or 2018 already, we had a little bit more than 38% of international cooperation. You see here, for instance, Colombia and Chile, it's 6.5, 6.7, and even more than that. This is something that Brazil has to pay attention very much. Next. And this is important because some of these countries, they belong to so-called the Mercosur movement. And he is another of this movement together with BRICS. Again, Brazil is not doing as well as South Africa, for instance. Next, please. This is a table that shows something very interesting, that many details inside of this paper that we published in 2018, showing how much Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Venezuela, Cuba, Peru, Uruguay, in other words, South America, Latin America countries, and the BRICS collaborate with Brazil. If you go for the 1, 2, 3, the fourth line, you see the numbers, the percentage is very small. So, that's to say, it's not only cooperation is necessary, it needs more than that. If Mercosur wants to go on, it's necessary to improve very much the cooperation between the countries, the scientists of these countries. And if you look here, the collaboration of this country with Brazil, it's even worse. Mexico, 1%, Argentina, 1.7%, Chile, Colombia, Venezuela, and here, China, 1.1%. In other words, we do not represent for them nothing that attract this collaboration with this country. Next. Okay, this comes to this very important project, which we shall call Science Without Borders, that we, as we see, the blue points, these are where Brazil was putting our students during the years 2012 to 2015. So we put out of Brazil, together CAPES and CNPq, 101,000 students and the other scientists together. And we brought many scientists also to Brazil. This, I believe, was one of the most exciting exercise for scientific, here is scientific diplomacy, because it's methodology, it's agreement with these universities throughout the world to put together our students on situations most of them will never get here. For instance, all these students, they live in the campus, all of them. When our university in Brazil, we can consider the possibility of having thousands of students living inside the campus. You know what this means? Contact every hour, every day with people from the rest of the world. This is an extraordinary model of science diplomacy. And unfortunately, this was destroyed in a few years. So if you say, how come you could do something like that? Oh, of course, spending money for that. But Brazil is so much accustomed to work with little money, that you say that this applied, let's say, 2 billion reais for 4 years. Oh, this is an enormous amount of money. I'm sorry. These students, they do not have more than 12 or 13 hours of class per day. The rest of this was working there in their subject. Most of them, they have were invited, and you signed many agreements with companies to have them spend some time inside the companies, since this was designed for the technological fields. So I appointed 10 reasons why the science border was a success of Brazil. Was the period that Brazil was received in all this country with as a progressive country, as a country that would think in the future. Next, please. Okay, these are the fields where these guys were, mostly engineers, as I said, but we have many people in health and biological science, and in exact science and earth science, agriculture, and others. Others include some people from social science, not many, but economics and the other sides of other social science. Next. Okay, I have the great pleasure to show these persons that were the ambassadors in several of these places where our students were. These guys, they did a nice work in Germany, Italy. Our great ambassadors, Jaguaribe in England, Fujita in South Korea. Unfortunately, he died a couple of years ago, and many others. It was something that Brazil should recognize as persons that developed this important subject called science diplomacy. And Brazil was received with red carpet in these countries. Next. Here, I explore with one of my students something very interesting. Is enough, it's a cooperation by itself is sufficient? No. In this article, which was published in 2016 in CNPq, we say that any kind of unbalanced international cooperation affects the usefulness of countries' scientific output, as well as their technological and social impact. For those who are curious, I recommend reading this article, because it shows, for instance, that those countries which did not make their own effort inside the country, they cannot get any good results in international cooperation. You need to do your homework. That's what Brazil has been doing for several decades. And now, and since this period, and even before, we could cooperate in a more sustainable and a more symmetric possibility of situation with our friends from outside. This paper has a lot of citation, because it was putting the finger in one thing that is very important for every country that wants to be developed. They must do their homework together, como we did at the beginning. We have help from France, from England, from United States, from Germany, many scientists that brought to Brazil, they help us to do our homework, but we did. We still do. We are still far away for where we can consider that we are ready to explore better the international cooperation. Let's give a number. Why these countries that put 2 or more percent of their gross national product, our PIB, for instance, put there more than 2%, they have at least 2,000 scientists per million of inhabitants. How much is Brazil? 803. In other words, must grow threefold to compete with these countries. That's why our post-graduation is so important and so necessary. Next, please. Consider this. For instance, is this only related to science itself? No. This is our experience of Embrapa. You see, Embrapa is 7 years old. You see how many countries have cooperation already? That's why we brought from CAPES Denise Nederman, who takes care of this at CAPES, at Embrapa together. You see here, Netherlands, Israel, United Kingdom, European Union, several projects. German was the inspiration. The Fraunhofer Institute was the inspiration of Embrapa, as also Embrapa also work as inspiration, but we did not follow their system that creates their own institute. Instead, we collect people from who had competencies in Brazil, which is the universities and some other research centers. Canada, Switzerland, Czech Republic, Sweden, United States, here at Latin America, so far, Uruguay, in many other countries that want to be together with us. Well, how this operates? It's not like science. It's completely dedicated to technological aspects, but the possibility is still there. I have a nice cooperation with Israel, for instance. It's called today the startups country. That's what we are working together. Next, please. Okay. Of course, some of the, if you take too long, please stop me. Augusto, Letícia. Which attracts cooperation with Brazil? Forest, tropical forest. Brazil, as we know, next, has 35.5% of area is tropical forest. Together with 9 other countries from the continent, we represent almost 53% of the tropical forests in the world. It's very attractive. If you look at one of these countries, the other 9 countries in Latin America is Costa Rica, for instance, Guyana, Venezuela, where most of our Amazon is. Next. So another paper we did together with Helenara. Most of you may remember her. Helenara was the CEO of our Portal of Periodics for during several years at CAPES. Okay, and which fields they are exploring projects with forest? Environmental science, of course, college, plant science, forest, geoscience, agriculture, geology, but in meteorology and the other fields. Next. And here, it's our conception that at Embrapa, we started that at CAPES, but continue at Embrapa, which big areas, they have this attraction, they are attractive for cooperation with Brazil. Agriculture, biodiversity and bioeconomy, sustainable energy, exact science, especially physics and astronomy, biomedical science, molecular biology, biotechnology, tropical medicine, and engineer. And this means that if you are not prepared, basically, in these fields, we are not cooperating, we're being explored. And that's why it's required to have the homework being done. Next, please. And this new technology, that's what Embrapa is involved in all these new technologies. This is not attractive, but we also need cooperation. In artificial intelligence, robotics, advanced manufacturing, IoT, smart cities, machine learning, graphene. We have a cooperation for one of the most important groups where the Premier Nobel, and this is new materials, for instance, nanotechnology, communication system, include now the new 5G development. Next. However, we still have a big challenge. I don't know how much you can see this, but it's the size of these spheres are the size of the economy and the capacity to be developing themselves. And at the beginning, it's the percentage of the gross national product that this country are applied in science and technology. And you can see Israel above everything, but you have Finland, South Korea, Japan, Sweden, many others. And down here have China, which 2 years before this, it was 2015, China was close to Brazil, 1.4, 1.5. China is going to 2% and going even further to get new numbers. And Brazil is still there, 800, a little bit more than 800 scientists per million inhabitants, and far away from the 2% that is required to be considered a country with the possibility of a better development. And if you see it's 2,000 of these scientists per million of inhabitants seems to be a threshold. If you are above this, okay. If you are below that, you must grow. China is here, but you'll be there soon, if you consider they have a big population. Okay, so this is our big challenge, to explore more and more science and scientific diplomacy. Thank you very much.